My name's Bond. James Bond.
In the 1960s, the producers of the television show Doctor Who were faced with an enormous problem. William Hartnell had defined this brand new icon, but he clearly could not keep going on as the Doctor, and so recasting needed to be considered. Thing is, most of the audience were children and families, and the question was, would they be willing to accept someone brand new in the part? Patrick Troughton took over and proved most assuredly that there was a bright future. Through the concept of regeneration, there was a built-in story reason as to why the Doctor could be recast, have a brand new personality, and yet they're still the same person, just with a new face. So what does this have to do with James Bond? I always thought there was a weird kinship between these two properties. Both are long-standing British icons who began in the 1960s, both largely tried to do standalone stories until the 2000s, both have been reinvented several times in order to stay relevant. Both have fandoms who debate on who the best incarnation is, with a lot insisting on one or two particular actors. Both had dramatic revivals in the mid-2000s, and both celebrated their 50th anniversary in style. That said, I'd say that Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman had the bigger challenge on their hands. How do you possibly follow on from Sean Connery, the man who defined the role of 007? Over 400 people were considered, including John Richardson, Terence Stamp, Michael Gambon, and a 25-year-old Timothy Dalton. Ultimately, the part went to George Lazenby, a completely new face to cinema. Various accounts have been offered on how exactly Lazenby was introduced to the producers, from a chocolate bar commercial, to a barbershop encounter, to Lazenby forcing his way past Saltzman's receptionist into the office. Whatever the story, Lazenby was now set to work on perhaps the toughest and most emotionally demanding film of the series, and if it didn't work, there was a very good chance that Bond would have ended right then and there. On Her Majesty's Secret Service was the perpetually postponed film that everyone in the Bond family was interested in tackling at some point. It was originally considered as a possible follow-up to both Goldfinger and Thunderball, but for various reasons, it was delayed until after You Only Live Twice. Thing is, it was almost postponed again. Harry Saltzman proposed the idea of adapting The Man with the Golden Gun next, with Roger Moore lined up to play the part. It seemed like a good move. Roger's name had been tossed around before as a possible choice for Bond, and The Man with the Golden Gun had the distinction of being Fleming's final novel. Unfortunately, political instability in Cambodia, the area they were considering filming in, forced them to scrap their plans, and so Majesty's was finally given its shot. The original book, which was written while Dr. No was being made, is quite highly regarded amongst fans, and in the past, both Connery and Guy Hamilton had at one time expressed interest in adapting the story. However, both of them had moved on to other projects by this point, and so finally longtime editor Peter Hunt was granted directing duties, and George Lazenby was the one wearing the shoulder holster this time out. 2 years after the events of the previous film, James Bond seems to be getting nowhere in his search for Blofeld. Upon a drive in the country, Bond encounters a young woman who is trying to commit suicide. He saves her, and she runs off before he can hear her side of the story. He meets up with her again at a nearby casino and discovers the woman is called Tracy. After spending the night with her, Bond is taken to her father, Marc-Ange Draco, a crime lord who pleads with Bond to continue pursuing her. Bond asks for something in return, a lead on Blofeld. Turns out Blofeld has been researching his family history and is claiming the title of Count de Beauchamp. Bond then works with the College of Arms and poses as a representative in order to meet up with Blofeld. He is taken to an institute high in the Swiss Alps, known for its research and development of allergy vaccines. Now it's up to Bond to put all these disparate pieces together and try to figure out Blofeld's new scheme, which may have terrifying consequences for the whole human population. This is a far more complex story than a lot of the past films, with several moving parts and characters that seem to be wholly unrelated to each other. In fact, the film runs in at 2 hours and 20 minutes, and leaves Tracy's story to the side for a large chunk of that running time. Yet it all comes together very nicely, and while I do have some issues with the pacing of the film, Majesty's is one of the best plots in the series. It helps that we're going back to a more faithful adaptation after You Only Live Twice basically abandoned most of its source material, but it's also just because this is an interesting tale. Bond feels far more human than he ever has before, and it's great to allow him to be challenged and affected throughout the film. Now, I certainly don't mind the charming action man image of Connery who takes most things in stride, but my preference has always been for a flawed hero who can bleed and be hurt. This movie is all about looking towards the future. Sometimes that future can be bright, other times it can be bleak, but you must find a way to move forward. Bond is finally considering a life outside of MI6, all because he has finally found a woman he can share his life with. I'll get to how Tracy ties into this theme a little later, but she is also grappling with a path forward. This film is set at Christmas time, a part of the year where people take stock of their lives and prepare for the prospective year. This may have been intentional, but it very well could be a coincidence that the story with this thematic coding is the film where the producers have to prove to the world that James Bond is bigger than any one man. Granted, Sean Connery casts a big shadow, but I'd like to think the character of James Bond is a role much like Sherlock Holmes. Many different actors can come in and offer their own interpretations. They are definitely looking towards what has been done before, but each actor can come in and build upon the past and add new layers to the character. Majesty's is quite the success in many ways, but it somewhat falls short of this key goal, finding a suitable replacement for Connery. George Lazenby is the major pitfall of this film. Now, there are things I like about him. He's certainly got the look of the character down. He's invested in making this story work, and when he's with the right co-star, he shines. I'll get more into some of the supporting cast in a minute, but Lazenby does have some talent that can be nurtured into something special. However, for every great moment with him, there will be two other weaker or substandard ones that pop up. Most of his quips fall flat, despite them working on the page, and his acting range is fairly limited. Lazenby's Bond feels like a more jovial character, and he can't quite sell me on the professionalism or cat-like cool I think the character needs to have. In short, it's a bit like watching an impersonator in the role a lot of the time, albeit one with potential. While Connery might have delivered a better performance, I'm convinced he would have felt out of place here, as this film is quite different in style to the previous 5. Thus, I do think this film requires someone new in the part, but going with Lazenby was insane. I get that the producers were feeling enormous pressure. The studio wanted a new film soon, and to somehow practically get Connery back without actually getting him back. Plus, this was perhaps one of the most important times where the series desperately needed a hit. While almost everyone else steps up to the plate and hits a home run, Lazenby had expectations put upon him that just weren't realistic for him to meet, and thus he was kind of set up to fail. So I don't think this was entirely his fault. I've certainly seen worse performances, but it strikes me a bit like watching Russell Crowe in Les Miserables or Pierce Brosnan in Mamma Mia. These are clearly talented people who could have made something of their part, but they were just wrong for the type of film that they are in. Had Lazenby been in another standard Bond film like The Man with the Golden Gun or A View to a Kill, he might have gotten away with this performance, but not in this one. It's a shame because, like I said, the rest of the cast is wonderful. Dame Diana Rigg plays one of the best women in the series. Tracy isn't so memorable just because she marries Bond at the end. She's memorable because she has a large part in the story and is a compelling character in her own right. She's a person who's at the end of her rope. She's had a difficult life and seems to find no joy in even the little things because she's burnt herself out. She doesn't believe she has a future, and so she lives each day like it's her last. At the beginning of the film, she's about to end her life and just float away without making any kind of mark on the world. Through her encounters with Bond, she finds a kindred spirit who also lives each day like it's his last, but he makes each of those days count. Both are versed in the dangers of the business, and thus they are drawn to each other. Bond loves her free, individualistic spirit, and so it's understandable why he thinks he'll never find another person like her. The tragedy at the end isn't just that Bond is robbed of the only other thing he may have found purpose in than his job, it's that Tracy is robbed of the most precious thing she can think of: a future. It's heart-wrenching, and I love that while Majesty's is still a classic Bond film through and through, it's a film with an extra layer of character that the filmmakers sought to get right, and I think they succeeded. It'll be quite some time in the series before we get to see another film reach beyond being just a great standalone Bond film. Telly Savalas is exactly the kind of villain I love from this series, from the megalomaniacal group. He's fiercely intelligent and even leads his own men into battle. As a kid, I used to be put off by a more physical Blofeld, who hops on skis and can throw a punch. As I grow older, he's exactly the kind of person I imagine would lead Spectre. He mostly delegates his tasks to his subordinates, but he's never afraid to do his own dirty work. I can understand if people can't get past his American accent, but it never bothered me. While I loved Blofeld in previous films, I never felt as though he was present enough in those stories. And when we did finally see him, I wanted more of him. Here we get both the unseen mastermind and the physical menace. It's pretty terrific. My favorite scene with him is when he explains his plan to Bond. I guess I'm just a sucker for these kinds of scenes, as they tend to be a highlight for me in the other films as well. I'm also really enamored by the visual symbolism of Blofeld operating from Piz Gloria. In various mythologies and religions, the reigning god rules from on high, and yet it is Blofeld, the devil incarnate, that is above the people and seeming to serve a noble cause while he plans their destruction. It's a very nice touch, and a variation of it is used in Moonraker, which I like there as well. Except here, it's a more picturesque setting, and because the film takes place over a joyous season like Christmas, it's a better fit for me. Gabriel Verzetti does a fine job with Marcon's Draco. He's not quite in the same league for me as Karen Bay or Felix Leiter, but he contributes some warmth and charm to the film. He does have a rather outdated and sexist view of his own role as a father, but I'm actually okay with it here because the film itself doesn't seem to espouse that same view of Tracy. I also love that he's part of the assault on Piz Gloria at the end, and we get to see him as a mirror to Blofeld. I have no problem believing these two are rivals in crime despite never seeing them on screen together. I also love Ilsa Steppen as Irma Bunt. She's got such a striking face that can be both cold and warm. She reminds me of some of the teachers I had in school, and that may be why I'm equally amused and terrified by her. Like her master, she has no problem getting involved in the dirty work. She leads the search for Bond down in the village, and she's the one who actually gets to kill Tracy at the end. I know she won't make an impression on everybody, but she does with me. The MI6 regulars of M and Moneypenny are also wonderful here. In the Connery era, they were important and memorable side players. Here, I think both Bernard Lee and Lois Maxwell give their best performances as their respective characters. It's amazing that while Lazenby is a far lesser actor than Connery, these are some of the few scenes where I'm not longing for a different guy in the part. Moneypenny also finally gets to play a small role in the story, as she's the one that makes Bond's resignation a request for 2 weeks leave. And it says quite a lot about what Bond means for both of these people. Peter Hunt does a fine job directing, with most of the departments giving their all. The action is spectacular, and that's thanks to both the stunt workers and the cinematography. The punches hit hard and feel their weight. Plus, we've got some great scenarios here. Skiing has become something of a staple for these films, and yet I feel like they were never done better than here in Majesty's. The choice to have Olympic skier Willie Bogner Jr. hold the camera on the ground level and have Johnny Jordan up in the air was a masterstroke, and it results in some of the best action the series will have until the 1980s. We get to marvel at these amazing locations with Jordan shots and then feel right in the thick of things with Bogner's material. The combination is breathtaking, and I'm still amazed how well these sequences hold up after 50 years. John Barry has always been a reliable hand in these productions, but he happens to turn in one of his best scores here. After re-listening to the Barry soundtracks, I've noticed that he tends to reserve the Bond theme more than most composers and let his original material carry most of the work. Here, I get the sense that Hunt may have asked him for more of the Bond theme throughout, and yet it never feels out of place. The choice to have synthesized bass with the orchestra gives the score both the energy and the style that a Bond soundtrack should have, and I sorely miss this technique. Thankfully, Barry chose to bring back the idea for the Living Daylights, and it's a large part of the reason why that score is my favorite of the series. Plus, Barry had the best secondary action piece the series ever got, the main theme. The second that bass starts up, I get giddy, and the muted alpine horns add a sense of heroism. I've gotten some criticism for not placing the theme in my ranking of Bond theme tunes. I can offer some consolation to the disappointed. It would have been top tier alongside You Know My Name and Diamonds Are Forever. Finally, Barry gets a beautiful piece to underscore the romance. We Have All the Time in the World is perfect for crystallizing the emotion of their relationship in a passionate way, and I can't listen to the song without being thrust right back into the scenes with Tracy and Bond. That heavy identification of the music with these characters is the reason why I have a tough time with the song coming back in No Time to Die, whereas I'm fine with the main theme being used in the scene with Bond and M on the Thames. Overall, this score is what I think of when I have to think of a 60s spy score, and I know I'm not alone in that. Brad Bird wanted John Barry to compose the music for The Incredibles, but ultimately that ended up not happening. Instead, Michael Giacchino offers a very Barry-esque score, and a remix of Majesty's theme was used in several of the trailers. If I have one problem with the production, it's the editing. Sometimes it really serves its purpose, and at other times it feels too choppy and rushed. I get the feeling that this was a stylistic choice on Hunt's part. He likes to use editing to inject excitement into the footage, and this film feels like a Hunt movie through and through. While I'm glad that he definitely got enough footage for the film, unlike Terrence Young, the quick editing and some odd shots here and there are pretty distracting. John Glenn is the credited editor of the film, and yet I feel like Hunt had one hand on the wheel in the editing room. If you compare Majesty's with Glenn's other editing jobs on The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, it feels very scattered. Beyond the quick cutting, I also question Hunt's choice of placing beats. This film really drags in the middle where Bond is impersonating Sir Hilary Bray. It's weird because the first 50 minutes are great and the last hour is great, but there's a good half hour where the film seems to slow to a crawl. It feels interminable. Watching this film again, I noticed a lot of effort being made to convince you that Lazenby is the same man as Connery, like with the reminiscence scene in Bond's office, the main titles playing images and clips from past films, Moneypenny's line "Same Old James," and the notion of Bond having a crusade to track down Blofeld. Yet Majesty's contains perhaps the biggest continuity error of the entire series. In the last film, Bond and Blofeld had met up finally, and it was a big deal. Yet the two of them meet up again 2 years later, and it takes a day or two before Blofeld finally recognizes Bond. Now, I know why this happened. The producers usually take these films one at a time and don't really concern themselves with preserving continuity, and this kind of comes back to bite them again in the next film. Plus, the filmmakers wanted to closely adapt the novel, and On Her Majesty's Secret Service originally came before You Only Live Twice, so that was originally not an issue. I have also heard that the filmmakers were considering adding a line about how Bond got plastic surgery in between films, which would have made sense, I guess. I'm glad the plastic surgery notion got dropped, as that would have only have taken you so far in carrying on with more films before you'd have to acknowledge Bond's perpetual youth. So how do I reconcile this continuity error? The truth is, I don't. It was an error on the filmmaker's part and should be treated as such. It doesn't bother me as a casual viewer, but it does bug me as a fan invested in the series. I'm still clueless on how to resolve this issue in a satisfying way, but then again, it's not like the series is going to make a point of maintaining a strict continuity. I mentioned a few reviews ago the codename theory. This potentially would solve the issue, but the theory overall creates larger problems for the series that are harder for me to ignore than this one. As long as I'm not thinking about the continuity error or am watching the series in order, I can get past it. The film still works remarkably well, and so I'm willing to overlook the goof for the sake of entertainment, which is probably the filmmaker's goal anyways. A bigger nitpick that I have is with the ending. Not the way that it happens, it's great, and like I said, wonderfully heartbreaking, but the music choice. I know the producers didn't want the audience to leave in such a downer mood, but it kills the emotions for me every time to have a blaring version of the Bond theme over the last shot with the bullet hole in the glass. It's contrary to the artistic intent of that ending. And alongside the experience of love being placed over the GoldenEye end credits, it's one of my least favorite notes to leave a film off with. The last thing I want to cover is the dubbing of Lazenby. George Baker does a fine job with the vocal performance, but I cannot figure out why the producers felt like Bond needed to impersonate Sir Hilary Bray's voice. I know that Lazenby tried to copy Baker's way of speaking a bit, so the dubbing may have been the production's way of offering something better than Lazenby's mimicry. Yet I can't figure out the story reason why Bond needed to fake the voice at all. It doesn't sound like Blofeld would have heard Bray's voice anyways, since it was Gumbald that was dealing with the College of Arms. Plus, Bray's description that was sent to Blofeld was adjusted to resemble Bond anyways. So unless we're operating on Clark Kent disguise rules, I don't see the point of this. But if you do, please leave me a comment and let me know. In a lot of ways, On Her Majesty's Secret Service feels like a soft reboot. In the same way that I described Dr. No as a pilot film, I'd almost describe this one as feeling like a second pilot for the series. It reinvents itself in a way that's true for the films, while also being its own thing. And that's why I think it stands out from the rest of the franchise. It feels so singular in a way that the other films do not. Despite middling reviews and a poorer box office reception than You Only Live Twice, the series continued onwards. And in the next few entries, both Sean Connery and Roger Moore would get their chances to re-establish Bond's place in cinema. For the longest time, Majesty's was regarded as the black sheep of the series, and while the series itself made sure not to forget the film entirely, it was often tossed off by both fans and audiences. Thankfully, time has been very kind to this film, and it's now often regarded within the fan base as one of the very best entries. Even today, this film has quite the legacy. Christopher Nolan has said in the past that this is his favorite film of the series, and you can definitely feel this film's influence in several elements in Inception. For Daniel Craig's final Bond film, No Time to Die, the story, characters, and even music evokes Majesty's with reverence. So how do I feel about it? Well, I can understand why some people may disregard this film. I must admit, I did the first time out as well. Over repeated viewings, it's become a favorite of mine. Oh, it's got things to criticize, but on the whole, On Her Majesty's Secret Service features the series at its very best and is a wonderful addition to the roster. The story is great, the cast for the most part is great, the action is great, the music is great, the dialogue is great, heck, even the great is great. I can certainly understand some of the gripes fans tend to lodge at this one, but I hope that those that take issue with it can look past the problems and see Majesty's as a shining jewel of the series that I think it is. It's one for the ages and is a grand way to close out the golden age of Bond films. George Lazenby is often just mentioned as either the one-off Bond or the worst of the Bond actors. Many times when a new performer comes into an iconic role and underperforms, they'll be called the George Lazenby of the series, much like George Clooney with Batman or Alan Arkin with Inspector Clouseau. Yet Lazenby actually did a lot for the series, both good and bad. His different take allowed for the following films to have a different kind of Bond than whatever Connery felt like delivering at the moment. Bond could be hurt, he can be emotionally disturbed, he can be obsessed beyond all rationality, and most importantly, he could be a human being with flaws and a character arc. Both Timothy Dalton and Daniel Craig would build their interpretations off of this foundation, and I would argue did it better. But I don't think the filmmakers would have been as willing to go with their takes if Lazenby's film had completely bombed with the box office, critics, and fans. At the time, it certainly looked like it had, but time has been kind to Honor Majesty's Secret Service, and the filmmakers are well aware of the higher stature the film now enjoys. As for the negative, the experience working with Lazenby was quite poor. Despite public reassurances from the filmmakers and the fact that Lazenby was offered a 7-film contract, various other sources continue to tell tales of Lazenby's arrogance and unprofessionalism. In short, the filmmakers learned their lesson. You cannot just put some handsome man in a tux and have him saying the lines. He needs to be committed to the part. He needs to be willing to be a true collaborator and a professional. And he needs to be able to handle the stress of being Bond in the mind of the public. I think the filmmakers have done a remarkable job in casting Bond since then. While many are considered, few are chosen, and those that are phenomenal actors who have all brought something to the role. Whatever their personal experiences were and how they feel about hanging up the holster, all of them speak fondly about the character himself. So even if Lazenby's performance was a mixed bag and he's often put at the bottom of best Bond ranking lists, I believe he too has contributed in an undeniable way to the legacy of the character and should still be considered a positive addition to the series.
Bond. James Bond.
There's a vast difference between the public and the fandom when talking about opinions on film franchises. Public opinion often suggests arbitrary trends, like the even-numbered films within a series are the only good ones, that all films after a certain point are garbage, or that after a key person left, the series has never been quite as good. However, opinions within fandoms are generally more nuanced. Especially with James Bond, every film, character, or aspect is defended by someone somewhere as being the best of the series. Growing up, I always thought that Timothy Dalton was underrated, given that a lot of public retrospectives and documentaries and interviews that I had seen with casual fans were quite dismissive of his tenure. But upon entering the Bond fan community, I quickly learned that this was not the case. I still think the public are too quick to dismiss his 2 films, but I'm glad Bond fans are more considerate about what Dalton tried to bring to the series, and even if he's not your favorite, I'd be surprised if the most cynical fan couldn't get something out of the 2 efforts. With Roger Moore now firmly out of the picture after 1985, the search began in earnest for a new James Bond. You would think since the filmmakers had been anticipating Roger's retirement for some time that this process would have gone smoothly, but nothing could be further from the truth. Various names were suggested and some tested. The favorite seemed to be Sam Neill for a while, but the holdout was Cubby. The crew's eyes then turned to Pierce Brosnan, who was just finishing up Remington Steele and who had been on their minds since he came to visit the set of For Your Eyes Only. Pierce was tested and met with enthusiastic approval by all. Trying to capitalize on the announcement of the new 007, NBC reversed their cancellation decision of Remington Steele at the last minute, and thus Pierce was no longer available. This delayed the production of the film long enough that Timothy Dalton, longtime contender for the part, suddenly became available, and on such short notice, he agreed to become the 4th James Bond. With Timothy now in place, filming began immediately on The Living Daylights, just in time to celebrate the series' 25th anniversary. James Bond survives a training exercise on Gibraltar where an enemy kills another 00 agent and leaves behind a message saying "Smirt Spionum," death to spies. Sometime later, a Russian general named Koskov reaches out to the British about defecting and expressly asks for 007 to protect him while out in the open. During the night of the defection, Bond instinctively shoots the other sniper's gun instead of her, deducing that she could not have been a professional KGB agent as was reported. Once over to their side, Koskov explains that Spionum is a secret operation meant to eliminate foreign spies and put in motion by General Pushkin, the head of the Soviet intelligence. Soon afterwards, Koskov is kidnapped from the British safe house he is being held at. In retaliation and thinking that the Russians were responsible, M orders Bond to assassinate Pushkin. Sensing that something is off about this whole plot, Bond goes off on his own to track down the woman sniper and must piece together the clues he has to deduce which Russian general he should be targeting before the security of the West is compromised. The Living Daylights marks a return to the more grounded Ian Fleming-inspired stories. Beyond adapting the titular tale and the idea of Smersh, there's such an air of Fleming about this one. The short story, one of my favorites by the way, is an examination of Bond's reluctance to kill without reason, which has been mentioned a few times in the books before, like in the beginning of the Goldfinger novel. This film has some of that subtext, but it also demonstrates both the positive and negative consequences of Bond's instincts. For example, at the beginning, his instincts lead him to sparing Kara's life, which enables him to uncover the truth behind Koskov's defection. That same gut feeling has him holding back from killing Pushkin right away, which ultimately leads to a positive outcome. However, Bond's choice to operate under the radar for the first part has him calling in a favor from Saunders, which indirectly leads to his death at the fair. And Bond's rash dash to find the assassin afterwards also plants the seed of doubt within Kara about who Bond is, and thus leads him to being captured later. The film overall feels much smarter than other recent entries in considering the actions of Bond as a character within the story, and how that helps the film to progress in its tale. Bond in this outing is still a glorified action hero, but one that is a bit more relatable and doesn't automatically win a battle because his name is the biggest one on the poster. This is a refreshing way to go after the party days of Moore, and helps to endear this film to a more modern audience. Bond is a flawed character, one with some traction on his soul and a sense of world weariness. He doesn't enjoy the dirtier elements of his job, but his sense of duty and willpower gets him through the long nights. In a way, I feel like this film is more what Sean Connery wanted to do with Never Say Never Again. He was just a bit too early in his desire, and his production screwed him over on that goal. But we finally did start to get around to something like that later. I don't think there was ever such a stark tonal contrast between two actors than with Roger Moore and Timothy Dalton. Perhaps it was creative fatigue with Roger's style of films, or perhaps it was simply diminishing returns. Whatever the reason, the Eon team were eager to try something different, and now unburdened with the expectations that came with an established actor, you would think the team would feel as free as a bird. However, that's not exactly the story I'm seeing unfold on screen. Because Dalton came onto the project so late, the writers had to write the story and character fairly in the middle in terms of tone, and the finished film still has some leftover Moore-style elements. The opening sequence in particular is a good example of this. It seems to be a training exercise with a grim atmosphere, what with a killer stalking double O's. But there are still light-hearted touches like animals and pedestrians, confused soldiers, bored women on yachts. Honestly, you could have written this to have been in front of either of the last two adventures, substituting Timothy with Roger, and I don't think most people would notice the difference. Yet the film works in these bits better than you might expect, and they don't come off as egregious as the gondola through St. Mark's Square or a drunk doing an exaggerated double take. I think this was thanks to the filmmaker's willingness to adapt the film to the actor while in production. As filming progressed, rewrites could be done, and Dalton's sensibilities could color the project, thus allowing for that dramatic shift the filmmakers were looking to accomplish. There's a famous deleted scene where Bond rides a carpet down some wires, making it look like a magic carpet. I get the sense that there may have been more things like this in the original script, but I applaud the filmmakers for being willing to kill their darlings this time, letting the film and actor speak for themselves as to what the tone should be. As such, I'm amazed that Timothy Dalton does as well as he does given the circumstances. Not only did he not have much time to prepare, but he was very nervous on set. He wasn't used to this kind of publicity, and he wasn't sure if the crew being serious about doing a new kind of Bond film. Thankfully, the crew were serious, and Dalton grew into the part. I've always been very vocal about my love for the man, and that comes from a few sources. First, he cares a lot about the characters he plays, and when he can, he does a lot of careful research. Dalton was well versed in the Ian Fleming books and was a big fan, thus his desire to make Bond more human, which leans right into what I enjoy most. Dalton makes this translation a beautiful thing to watch, though I think his best performance is yet to come. The second source for this love is that his duology is far more careful about its plot construction, purpose of characters, and its thematic bridges, like I talked about earlier. The Dalton films are very much classic Bond in a lot of ways, though they signal a transition of sorts. As a franchise, James Bond has had to adapt over the years in order to stay relevant, and while there are many fans who wish we would have stayed closer to what Goldfinger and Russia were doing, the fact of the matter is that if we kept doing those kinds of films and Bond had kept all the elements of Connery's performances, the franchise would have become outdated and there wouldn't be the large fan base now. Most of us came in through the Roger Moore or Pierce Brosnan or Daniel Craig eras, and these are the ones that help to ensure that the Bond series remains beloved and continues to churn out grand and exciting adventures today. Dalton's push towards films with teeth and a concentrated direction is part of this lineage, and I hope that his current reappraisal continues for a while. I'm not a huge fan of Maryam d'Abo's Cara Malovi, and I know that's probably my most unpopular opinion about the film. I think the choice to start the movie with the short story and then explore the sniper character further is an inspired one, but when I get to know Cara, she comes up wanting for me. She's far more realistic, isn't so woman's fantasy hear me roar kind of a thing that some of the other Bond women were, and I will admit that's a refreshing change of pace here. Plus, I'm a fan of films whose leading ladies have the central stories built around them. But Cara's emotional naivety and almost childlike approach to certain things does grate on me a bit. I'm glad she starts to take more charge by the end of the film, but it takes 90 minutes for us to get there, and that's a little too long for me. I also don't feel like she quite works with Dalton on a chemistry level. I'm not saying she needs to be spunky or anything, but I'm not sensing any kind of spark, nor do I feel an emotional connection between the two, letting them relate to each other. I'd probably be okay with that if the film wasn't trying to portray the relationship as more tender. Dalton and Dabo do their best to sell that angle, but I'm not convinced that's the angle that should have been done here. She's not awful, but she's never been a favorite of mine. The film has two central villains, and unfortunately I think this is another misstep. I like Euron Krabbe as General Koskov. He has a disarming charm that makes it hard to see him as a proper villain, which I love. It makes the knife twist harder when you discover his insincerity. Krabbe is a fine actor, having worked with Paul Verhoeven on a few films and doing a fine part in Harrison Ford's The Fugitive. And while he's not my favorite camp of villains, he's a delightful presence. I just wish the idea of him having some kind of affection with Bond was taken a little further, either by having Bond treat him as a friend too, or by letting Koskov experience some sort of serious consequence for treating Bond more fairly than he should. Brad Whitaker unfortunately doesn't work for me. Joe Don Baker is an odd choice for the role of a military-obsessed arms dealer, and maybe because he infrequently shows up during the runtime, he seems to be a smaller presence in the film's story. I like how Bond dispatches him, meeting Whitaker's superior weaponry with one of his idols crushing him. However, he seems to be less of a threat than he should be, and comes off a little too juvenile, like a kid with delusions of grandeur about his social status. In another film, I would probably like this more if we got to pay that off in some way. The villain got to show off how dangerous the mentality is by going out into the field and using that weaponry with an unstable mind. But as it stands, he's one of the lower points of the cast, and his presence takes away from Koskov, which unfortunately hurts the film's standing for me in the series. I never thought much of Necros, so you can imagine my surprise when I found him to be one of the bigger upsets from my Henchmen ranking video. He's an effective assassin, but I felt as though he wasn't strong enough to justify a higher ranking. Upon further examination, maybe I did him dirty. I love that our first glimpse of him is tossed off and that the audience likely wouldn't suspect a thing. But then we see him assume various disguises in order to infiltrate the safe house, and that's very impressive. There's an almost Red Grant quality to the man. The final fight with him on the back of the Hercules plane is breathtaking as well. But I feel like there's something missing from him to make him a true standout of the series. Maybe it's because he's deliberately designed to be unmemorable while in disguise that he escapes my thinking. But maybe that in of itself is quite the endorsement for an assassin. I don't know, maybe a one-on-one scene with him and Bond before the final fight would have helped. Either a dialogue scene or another fight where Necros escapes and Bond has to keep his guard up from now on. I don't know, something. As many of you probably know, this film was initially intended to have a larger role for General Gogol, but Walter Gotell's health prevented that from happening, so the part was rewritten for a new character, General Pushkin, played by John Rhys-Davies. I love Davies. I've seen him in many things, and I really like the character of Pushkin, but this would have been an excellent way to pay off Gogol's recurring presence in the series for the last decade. That said, Davies makes Pushkin seem more directly involved with operations than Gogol was, thus the mutual respect between him and Bond comes across better. Sure, Gogol was involved in plenty of operations before, but I don't think he was doing anything more than what M might have done, and I don't know if I could have seen Robert Brown deliberately faking his death in order to trick the villains. The scene between Pushkin and Bond in the hotel is my absolute favorite of the film. The dialogue is well written, each actor is carefully playing the other, and the tension is ramped up considerably. It feels so true to the spirit of the darker side of the Bond character that I could have happily watched a scene twice as long as this. It's one of my favorite scenes in any Bond film. Cameron Shaw continues this film's streak of good allies. Art Malik is another fine character actor that I've seen in a few things, and I like the combination of intelligence and battle-hardened sense that he brings to the role. Saunders is also a fine Bond ally. The rapport between Wheatley and Dalton really feels like it could only have come from two men in the same line of work. And Saunders' willingness to do Bond a covert favor endears him to me. His death is powerful, mostly because of the moments before and after. Bond's sincere gratitude to him, followed by the boiling rage at the man's death, is a great character moment. It actually helps to sell Bond's going rogue in License to Kill, as I've already seen a man visibly affected by a friend's death and how that led to an emotionally rash act. Speaking of Felix Leiter, the character weirdly ends his 14-year absence from the series in the form of John Terry. I'm not entirely sure why Leiter is here in this story, as I'm pretty confident they didn't know during the production of this film what the next one was going to do with the character, so reintroducing him to the series now feels arbitrary. He only really serves as a familiar face so as to ease Bond after the manhunt. His role either should have been expanded, maybe providing us with some critical piece of the puzzle we didn't know before now, or been cut out entirely. Lastly, we have the second actress to play Moneypenny in the official series, Caroline Bliss. Personally, I think she comes across a little too young for the part, and she only really gets a few scenes with Dalton here, doesn't meet him at all in the next film, so it's entirely understandable that we never got to see her full potential. But just based on this film, I'm comfortable with saying she's not a patch on most of the other actresses. After veering into more campy waters with the last two films, John Glenn returns to the Sea of Espionage for this outing, and that's a relief to me. Not that I minded some of the stuff in the other two, but Glenn made a mighty statement about his take on Bond in For Your Eyes Only, and I was anxious to get back to more of that. Daylight still has its lighthearted and more fantastic bits, but it really tones down their prominence in favor of a quieter atmosphere and intrigue. As such, Bond's world feels the most dangerous that it's been since the early days of Connery. The film trusts its audience to have the attention span to go 10 or 15 minutes without some action sequence, and we are well rewarded. There are still great bits of action, like the ice chase and the fight on the cargo net, but some of the quieter scenes are also some of the most memorable parts of the film. I've already talked about the hotel scene, but I also love the sniper sequence in Kara's arrest. However, the film starts to run a little long at times. The Felix Leiter reveal and the Mujahideen extension to the Hercules sequence are bits that could have been cut. The fight with Brad Whitaker is another sticking point for me, though unlike the other two, this actually covers a necessary story beat. I think maybe it's because it comes after a prolonged action sequence and we're led to believe that we've dealt with most everything in the film's story by this point. It could also be because Whitaker's role in the story is diminished in comparison to Koskov's, and so he feels like a minor threat. I probably would have accepted Whitaker being dealt with by Pushkin and his crew in a quick scene, much like the Russian treasurer in Octopussy. Though that does mean we would have sacrificed a second scene with Pushkin and Bond, along with an okay fight scene. I'm not exactly sure how to fix this, but it's definitely a problem I feel while watching the film. Like the other 80s Bond films, Daylight is keenly aware of its position within the waning days of the Cold War. The period of détente and the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union colors this film in key ways. Cubby continues his mantra of not painting all the Russians as bad guys, and there's healthy skepticism about Bond and M over Koskov's claims of a mad Russian general. There's also Pushkin's reasonable choice to fake his own death so that he and Bond can uncover Koskov's plan. There's Bond's working with Rosika. It helps the audience to feel like they're watching real people who might respond as real people. And it helps the film immensely in demonstrating that Bond can work well both within the exaggerated spy fantasy and the restrained espionage thriller camps. The one aspect I'm iffy about is the Mujahideen. I don't think it's fair to criticize the film for including them, as they were a current world topic at the time, and the Bond filmmakers always start by looking at what's in the headlines, whether it be tackling the drug trade in License to Kill, the fall of the Soviet Union in GoldenEye, the media barons in Tomorrow Never Dies, and so on. Plus, you can't expect the filmmakers to have possessed the foresight to know what would happen to the organized Afghan resistance after the removal of Soviet troops from the region, which was formally announced the same month the film was released in the US, by the way. But I'm not gonna lie, watching this film in a post-9/11 world and knowing how a lot of modern terrorist groups were born out of the struggle, and this organization in particular, it makes me feel a little uncomfortable initially. The best I can do is compartmentalize and just enjoy the film as is, which isn't too hard to do, quite frankly. Part of this could be because we have what is, for my money, the best John Barry score in the series. I've raved about this soundtrack a few times, but it bears repeating. It's my favorite score in the series because there's never a dull moment. Barry has themes and motifs that interweave throughout, and he makes the connecting tissue interesting. Favorite tracks of mine include The Ice Chase, The Sniper Was a Woman, Approaching Kara, Mujahideen and Opium, and Hercules Takes Off. The Aha song is a fine Bond tune, following on from Duran Duran's effort for the last film, and it flourishes under Barry's traditional approach of using it both in action and ambiance. The Pretenders offer two songs that work beautifully within the score, Where Has Everybody Gone and If There Was a Man, the former serving as Necros' theme and the latter as the romantic underscore. But it's the iteration of the James Bond theme that is my highlight. It's funny because it really is just the orchestral version that Barry did during the Moore films, but with the added bass and synth hits, it makes a world of a difference. It's one of my favorite versions of the James Bond theme. A couple of minor things to close us out. First, I think it's interesting that both Dalton films have Bond operating outside of the service for a bit. Bond's trip to track down Kara and going to Vienna are meant to be under the radar from M. And then, of course, the entirety of License to Kill has Bond operate on his own. I think that's an interesting coincidence. I also have a question about a bit that's always bugged me. After the cargo net fight with Necros, Bond and Kara are suddenly over the Mujahideen escaping the Russian forces. After Bond took off on the runway from the airbase, he told Kara to keep the controls straight and steady. And then we had the fight with Necros, which went on for a bit. So how in the world are they by Kamran Shah and his army while they are escaping on horses from the Russians? The Living Daylights offers a classic Bond adventure with an exhilarating edge to it. I first saw this movie after watching License to Kill, so it was weird to see Dalton tackle something more standard, but I've come around on it quite a bit. It's a great ride. The few issues I mentioned are the things that are holding it back from my personal top 10 of the series, but it's so close a lot of the time. It's also great to see that other films haven't completely forgotten about this one, as elements of it show back up in later Bond adventures, most notably No Time to Die. Dalton makes a bold debut here, and while his reputation seems more based on his work in the next film, he comes in with a declaration of his own about how to tackle Bond as a franchise, and the filmmakers seem to be sustaining his vision wholeheartedly throughout the film. This is one of my most viewed entries in the series, as it ticks off a lot of what I love about Bond films, and I'm always happy to pop it in, even if there are other installments I prefer. At the time, it fared better at the box office than any of the series since For Your Eyes Only, and audiences seemed to be optimistic about what Dalton had to offer, so it seemed like Eon had started laying the foundation for another successful run. However, the next film would test that warm reception and would feature the boldest take on a Bond film yet.
In my business, you prepare for the unexpected.
Personal taste. It's the one area where we are supposed to be able to express ourselves fully without being rejected. Yet in today's world, it can quickly escalate to blood feuds if we're not careful. The thing to keep in mind is that personal taste is not about making broad statements representing everyone's minds. It's much more narrow and simply means I like or dislike this thing. License to Kill has always produced a mixed response when you take everyone's views into account. And that's not surprising. It's meant to be different and challenging to your ideas about a Bond film. The movie strips James down to his bare essentials to see if he can survive a more personal story, removed from the elegant and escapist adventures of the past. After the upswing from A View to a Kill to The Living Daylights in both critical reception and box office numbers, the filmmakers breathed a sigh of relief that the new Bond actor had broken the ice with a cautious public. With Timothy firmly established in the role, the ideas for Bond 16 signaled that the creative team wanted to steer into the skid with Dalton's interpretation and try a radical approach. John Glenn even acknowledged in interviews that it was a departure in many ways from tradition, yet they felt confident that the next film would allow them a creative freedom they had not felt in years, perhaps since the beginning of the series. The genesis for the story would be taken from current world issues involving drug barons. The script could be tailored to Dalton's strengths, and while the film would carry the identifiable elements that audiences came to expect from a Bond film, it would also carry that same crowd into a contemporary update of the character, continuing to cement the versatility of the greatest cinematic hero. It also ended up being the final Bond film for many of the key creative people who had been with the series for a long time, including Maurice Binder, Richard Maybaum, John Glenn, and even in a way, Cubby Broccoli. Though he would be present as a consulting producer for GoldenEye, License to Kill would be the final Bond film where he had an active producing role, often being on set and involved in almost every aspect of the production. A drug lord named Franz Sanchez is caught entering the US by the DEA, Felix Leiter, and James Bond right before Leiter's wedding. However, Sanchez bribes his way out of prison and sends his associates to kill the new Mrs. Leiter and maim Felix. Defying orders from MI6 and after having his authority revoked, Bond sets out to get revenge on Sanchez. He starts out on his own, but quickly finds himself in over his head, and soon recruits Sanchez informant Pam Bouvier. Once she is on board, the two head to the heart of Sanchez's territory to try to penetrate his organization and find some way of bringing him down, along with disrupting the drug trade of the world. License to Kill is the furthest aggression we've seen from the traditional cinematic Bond, but it also feels like Fleming's original vision updated for the late 80s. It's very much of its time, both in subject matter and execution. If you watch a lot of 80s action films like Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, RoboCop, or Rambo, you'll get what I mean. It feels far closer to those than Goldfinger and Thunderball. At the time, this seemed to suggest that Bond was squarely behind other films, trying to capitalize on their success in order to pave a new road forward. I think other than Moonraker and perhaps the 2006 Casino Royale, License is the one I think of when people criticize Bond for jumping on the bandwagon of film trends. To that end, I completely understand if it's not one of your favorites. The early films had such a unique identity that few afterwards seemed to replicate, and ever since Connery's first departure, the series never quite captured that same feeling again. And I don't think it's purely out of stubbornness to suggest that the series peaked early in its sui generis style. However, I'm not a purist. I don't demand that my series must stay the same course. I'm open to experimentation even if it leads to something lesser. And I don't believe Bond is a stagnant being that can only operate in a certain time of the world's history with a certain interpretation. I think James Bond is a more versatile character than people give him credit for, And that versatility and adaptability is why we're still talking about him 60 years later. License to Kill was one of the first films I saw from the series, and as such, I understood that Bond was not going to be exactly the same thing throughout the 20 official films that existed when I started. From my very first viewing on a Sunday afternoon, I was blown away, impressed with how much I enjoyed the movie given how counter it ran to the traditional image of Bond. There's still a bit of that baked into this one, but it was incredibly exciting, and more than any of the early films I saw, this one cemented me as a 007 fan. You could say that out of all of the films, this and Daniel Craig's Casino Royale are the closest to my heart, though that's not to say that I don't think there aren't better films than License, and that I don't prefer the classic Bond character. But this movie is breathtaking to me, and after Dalton proved how adept he was at tackling the classic Bond stories, I rejoice to see the creative teams take such a chance here. There are some stumbles, and I'd be lying if I said this was one of the best put together adventures, but every time I watch this, I get a huge smile and feel a renewed sense of enthusiasm for the series. Timothy Dalton is an actor that strives for something interesting with every role. I wouldn't think of him as the most serious of actors given some of the roles he's done more recently, and I wouldn't label him a method actor, but whenever I see his name in the credits of a movie, I know I will love something about it. His return to the reluctant agent whose sense of duty prevails over his desires was welcomed with daylights, though here, Bond has none of the security we associate with him. He's out on his own, out of his depth and knowledge, with only the help he can convince to come along with him, and flying by the seat of his pants. It's a foolhardy vendetta that no official government is willing to sanction, especially MI6 since it has no dog in this fight. And thus, while I knew Bond wouldn't die during the adventure, I was never exactly sure what would come next. Dalton grounds this with a human edge and believability that invites me to accept the danger and uncomfortableness of this untested part of Bond's world, and as a result, it's an impressive experience for me. His embrace of the controversial direction to strip Bond of his MI6 patronage and the man's polished and sophisticated suaveness proves the malleability of the character and how that can allow the series to change without losing what makes it special. I feel this Bond is still recognizable as the Bond from the last film, which was a true-to-form reinterpretation of the archetype that Connery personified, and this film still has the great villains, beautiful women, the stunts, the gadgets, the exotic locations, and the style one would expect from a Bond film, so I don't think it's entirely unidentifiable from what I would expect, it's just a different angle. This film contains the best performance from Dalton, and so he's the only Bond with multiple films to exit on his highest note. If you can't tell, I'm very much in the camp that wishes we would have gotten one or two more from him before GoldenEye. Carrie Lowell's Pam Bouvier is one of the great Bond women. She's fierce, driven, independent without championing it on the rooftops, resourceful, saves Bond's butt more than once, and has a wonderful chemistry with Dalton. She also has great comedic timing with Q, which helps the film to be interesting even when Bond isn't on screen. She fits so naturally as a character in the story, and while she only really becomes a figure halfway through the runtime, she justifies that inclusion. I have one minor issue with her, and that's about her jealousy with Bond and Lupe. It's nice that the woman actually has feelings and can be hurt through someone else's unintentional actions, but I'm not sure I needed her going all the way to visibly crying at the end of the film. I would have been fine with a more steeled performance of that moment, certainly moved to tears, but her face makes it seem like she's lost all hope, which I guess would be fine if they didn't immediately have her forgive Bond and make out with him because he jumped into the pool. If someone is hurt like that, I want to see the consequences. Either have Bond prove himself a little more in the last few moments that his heart lies with Pam, or tweak her performance of the emotional moment. Again, that's a minor gripe, and it doesn't sour me too much on a fantastic part of the film. Robert Davi's Franz Sanchez is another of the all-time great Bond villains in the series. In my villains ranking video, he was second only to Goldfinger. He's one of my favorite iterations of the darker side of Bond because I feel like he's an effective mirror. He has all of the same traits, the same streak of charm, coldness, and efficiency. Part of the reason I love this movie is because of the two sides of the same coin angle that both Davi and Dalton worked hard to make happen. It makes for a great comparison-contrast exercise while watching the movie. Bond and Sanchez place a high value in their friends and loyalty. Bond tries to get his allies out of as much harm as possible, while Sanchez relies on his cohorts immensely for his operations. Sanchez treats killings as an impersonal business, whereas Bond is more likely to be affected by those he sees. Sanchez is the ruler of a seemingly impenetrable kingdom that relies on secrecy and closed doors. Bond traditionally operates covertly and has the backing of MI6, an organization that's steeped in secrecy and closed doors. Bond relies on his readings of people to gauge the trust he should place in them, and Sanchez believes in the web of intimidation and lucre to ensure his safety. Bond unwittingly charms Lupe, whereas Sanchez tries to tempt Lupe with everything and gets nowhere with her heart. And that's just a small sampling of what you can do with these characters. Bond represents a cloaked invasion of Sanchez's territory, and it's fascinating to see how this seemingly omnipotent Baron can be brought down by one crafty bugger. Because Sanchez scares me, thrills me, and stimulates my analytical side, he solidifies his position as one of the greatest adversaries Bond has ever had. Bond at first operates based solely on informants, but he switches partway through to dethrone the monarch by incorporating his attendants into the scheme, sowing the seeds of distrust and doubt so that Sanchez is responsible for bringing himself down. As I've stated before, this plot is inspired by the excellent Akira Kurosawa film Yojimbo, which was later popularized in the West by Sergio Leone's remake A Fistful of Dollars, his first film with Clint Eastwood as the man with no name. These attendants of Sanchez are quite memorable to me. Benicio del Toro's Dario is the best of these, mostly for his youthful, energetic, and cruel presence. I also appreciate the sleazy Milton Crest, played by Anthony Zerbe. They have perhaps the most gruesome demises of the series, both of them causing me to flinch. Don Strout's Heller is a fine presence, necessary to sell the legitimacy of Sanchez's security, though he acts as a mole for a bit. Even Anthony Stark and Wayne Newton make for memorable faces, though I'll admit that I don't know what exactly to make of Newton's casting here. The performance is fine, it's the fact that it's Wayne Newton that makes me scratch my head. But then again, it's not like Bond hasn't cast singers into villainous roles before to great success. I do also like Killefer's presence here, as he serves as Bond's first real victory against Sanchez. I also particularly love how he plays his rage in the prison scene. He may be authentic in his anger, but if you watch Sanchez, you can read into Franz's face that he knows that Killefer is tempted by the $2 million bribe. I go back and forth on Talisa Soto's Lupe Lamora. It's clear to me that Soto's not a trained actress, given some of her line readings and timing. But the fact that she doesn't perform the character actually sells the resigned feeling Lupe has about her life. The series has done this a few times, the trapped woman who longs for an escape, and I'm usually a fan of these people, so while I'll typically dock points for flat readings, here they weirdly end up helping the matter. She derives little joy from her world as Sanchez has her in a gilded prison, a bird in a cage. The lengths he will go for her are astounding, but they are often evil and malicious, so Lupe has little to look forward to on a daily basis. In time, she seems like a character who would have committed suicide before long, and Bond happens to be the brightest spot at the right time. So I guess put me in the positive camp regarding her, since the lack of emotions convinces me of how dead the character feels inside, though if she were playing any other role, I'd be harsher. Bringing back a previous Felix Leiter really helps with our needing to bond with the character quickly, and while David Hedison was perhaps the best since Jack Lord, the oddness of casting John Terry in the previous film does conflict a bit here. I'd rather have Hedison than Terry though, so maybe I got the best of a few crummy options. Sharky is a lot like VJ, instantly likable and is easy to sympathize with. I really don't have any negatives to say about this guy, so his death hits a bit harder than most Bond ally deaths. I do like the presence of MI6 in the story. Robert Brown, in his final turn as the character, gets a great scene with Bond at the Hemingway house, and not since Majesty's have we had a chance for M to deliver this impassioned of a performance. I don't have much to say for the Moneypenny bit, except that like the scenes in Daylights, she actually gets to influence the story. And that influence comes in the form of Desmond Llewellyn's best performance as Q. I know sending the Gadget Master out in the field has been a point of contention for some fans throughout the Moore era, but this is the film where it makes the most sense. Q decides to take leave in order to help Bond based on Moneypenny's concern, and he's having so much fun. equipping Bond in the field again and participating in the action a bit. He's the best source of comedic levity in a film that needs it, and this is my favorite use of him in the entire series. And there are still 2 more people I want to mention. Pedro Armendariz Jr. plays the corrupt president of Isthmus, and of course this is noteworthy as he is the son of Pedro Armendariz, who played Karen Bay all the way back in From Russia with Love. The last person will come off a bit odd to some, but it's Christopher Neame as Fallon, the MI6 agent in Isthmus. He sells his performance well, though it's a 60-second role, really. So why do I bring him up? Well, it's because he's an actor that brings back a lot of fond memories for me. Among his roles with Christopher Lee in Dracula AD 1972 and his bit parts in Star Trek, Doctor Who, and The Prestige, I first knew him as the Dark Jedi leader Jarek in one of my favorite Star Wars video games, Dark Forces 2. Just a small connection that makes me smile. John Glenn, Cubby, and the crew finally make the push for this film to get a higher rating. This is the first Bond film to be rated PG-13 in the States and a 15 in the UK, along with some other similar ratings in other countries. Not that the previous Bond films were screaming for a higher rating, really, but several were starting to edge that line, with a few upping the emotional intensity and cursing counter. Quite honestly, I think a Bond film would be fine with any rating as long as it doesn't compromise the movie. I'm happy the filmmakers allowed this to go further in a story that really requires its edge. As Timothy said in an interview, the Bond films were never made to be family-friendly, quote, for 6 or 7-year-olds. And so while trying to go for mass appeal is a fine strategy with action films, there are times where you need that creative freedom more. Imagine if Schindler's List or Black Swan had been released with lower ratings. They probably still have some great scenes and moments in them, but watering down subject material that calls for a more mature approach does a disservice more often than not. Now, the opposite can be true as well. Putting more violence, swearing, and sex in films doesn't automatically make them any better. Some have accused License to Kill of doing this exact thing, but I don't see it. The story being told here demands stakes and emotions to be felt in the audience's bones, so I'm fine with going out on a limb here. And as I've already said, this movie gives license for Dalton to do what he wants with the part and be allowed to flourish. Until the Daniel Craig era, license is the most tailored for a specific Bond actor that we've seen in the series. The action scenes are spectacular, utilizing the best of the 80s Bond crew. Remy Julien coordinates the jaw-dropping tanker climax, making for one of the best finales in the series. The continuity is all over the place, but I can easily give that a pass when you have such crowd-pleasing moments as the truck on its hind wheels and the Stinger missile explosion. BJ Worth and Jake Lombard help with the aerial sequence, particularly making an impact with the pre-credits, with Bond going fishing for Sanchez's plane. The underwater bits are some of the best in the series, mostly due to them not being drawn out and the editing remaining tight. Plus, the major underwater bit ends with one of the most underappreciated stunts in the series. The bar fight may seem a little mundane of a setting for Bond, but I like how he and Pam work with each other here. There's just not really a dud here for me with all of the action bits. Due to his surgery post-op, John Barry could not participate for this film's score, leaving the door for Michael Kamen to compose. I'm generally not a huge fan of Kamen's efforts for action films. I like him much better when he's providing a symphonic background for Metallica tunes, but this is the major exception. Part of that is that he has one foot in the rock and roll world, permitting the music to be heavier in its hits and more fierce in its orchestration. From the first notes of the gun barrel to the amazing versions of the Bond theme throughout to the wonderful Latin influence, this is a favorite score of mine, and much like Live and Let Die, it helps to give the film a unique identity. While some of John Barry's scores and David Arnold's efforts feel like they could have been written for any other film, Kamen's feels so tied to this entry that I could not mistake it as being from one of the others. The title song, sung by Gladys Knight, has always had to compete in my mind with a lot of excellent Bond songs, and so it's never ranked highly for me. And I also never thought the song worked well tonally with the film. However, Knight belts it out with such force that it finally, after 20 years, has started to win me over. Still not a top 10, but I'm more likely to listen to it nowadays. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but upon finally hearing what Eric Clapton and Vic Flick had recorded originally for the movie, I gained a new appreciation for Knight's song. I also like the Patti LaBelle tune, If You Asked Me To, at the end, though I much prefer the Celine Dion cover. Some of the main criticisms of this film are centered around its harsher tone. License is not a film with escapist fun at its core. It's a film striving for anything to give it an edge, to make the Bond series feel like it belongs at the forefront of contemporary action cinema. This is a goal that several others have had, and it can be a detriment. I dinged A View to a Kill for trying to be both contemporary and classic at the same time, though I think others like Skyfall really succeed at that. License isn't trying to be a classic Bond film, though I think that helps in it not being muddied in its identity. And as much as I love classic Bond, I'm fine with different takes. However, there are bits that seem to stand out for people, like the increased violence, the sudden appearance of ninjas, the televangelist Joe Butcher, the stingers, and the winking fish. I've already said my piece about the violence and why that doesn't bother me. I'm out of my depth when it comes to judging Joe Butcher. I enjoy the performance and I love the idea of using a religious order as a cover for drug sales, but I'm not really sure it fits with this film. I'm split on the stingers, as it seems like one extra complication to a story that doesn't need them, but I do like that Bond keeps screwing up other operations as he goes about his own vengeance. The winking fish does bug me, as it seems almost too cute of an ending for this story. Finally, let's talk about the ninjas. I know this is a sore spot for some, but frankly, I don't see the issue. An undercover Hong Kong narcotic agent would have some sort of protection, and we do see them spying on Bond before the assassination attempt, so they don't come completely out of nowhere. Making the protection a martial arts focused duo does seem a little typical, but I quickly get over the initial shock, and they're only in the film for a few minutes, so it doesn't weigh much on me. License to Kill is not for everyone, and that's perfectly understandable. It's an acquired taste, and I don't think you're stupid for not liking it. It also doesn't mean that I'm better than you because I do. I think it's one of the most entertaining and original entries in the series, though I can appreciate how the tone and execution of the base idea turns people away. License to Kill at times seems to want nothing to do with what Bond had established as its cinematic identity over 25 years, and knowing what contemporary films had been offering at this time, it does seem to be an attempt to do what they did in order to stay relevant with modern audiences. However, I would argue that it still has all the trappings of a classic Bond film. Timothy is playing the truest version of the Fleming character we've seen on screen. It has several great characters, and there are so many moments that combine vigor, fun, and a general sense of badassery that I can't help but be entertained throughout the ride. It remains one of my favorites in the series, and much like I did with Daylights, I almost immediately put it back into the player because I enjoyed the viewing that much. Unfortunately, the mixed reception must be addressed. Some critics thought, like me, that it was the best that we had seen in years, while others were quick to put it in the column of worst films in the series. Box office-wise, it was released during a very crowded summer, given a poor marketing campaign, and came after a period of lower theater attendance in general. At the time, it seemed to be another sophomore slump, with even Dalton expressing some concern over the future of the series. But I think everybody walking out of it expected him to return for a third one. But I don't think anyone could have predicted what would happen for the next film, the first of the final decade before the new millennium. Timothy Dalton came to the role with a lot of respect and well-crafted notes. He was eager to get a shot at the man and worked hard to make both of his films fearless experiences. Utilizing his Shakespearean training, Timothy offered quite the contrast to the other three Bonds at the time. The two films were quite different from each other, though they obviously share some similar goals and attributes. They are noted for their increased intensity and focus on Bond as a flawed human being, trying to create an emotional connection with the audience, making the films darker and more in the spirit of the early Ian Fleming novels, and so on. He also got a real abrupt end to his reign as 007, thus he never firmly established himself with the public in the same way that most of the other actors have. Dalton's remains something of a controversial portrayal of Bond, having only 2 films, which serves as a signal to the uninformed observer that he just wasn't working out with either the public or the creators. Within the Bond fan community, the tale is woven differently. Here we experience a case of injustice, a promising actor who never got a fair shake with his different take on the character. who was robbed of a third or fourth film due to legal issues delaying the production of more adventures, and who had the potential to be one of the greats. Thankfully, looking closely at the two films gives us a lot to chew on and to speculate about, and I can confidently say that he will remain as one of my favorite Bonds. Both of the subsequent actors, more so Daniel Craig admittedly, took aspects from the Dalton era and built upon them. The darker and more human side of Bond was eventually accepted by the public at large when Craig made his 5 films, and it's argued that Daniel was more successful at that than Timothy. I love both actors, though I think I'm in the Dalton camp. If I reduce the series to raw statistics, how many films of an actor I like compared with how much I enjoy their individual performances in each, Dalton and Connery would come out as my 2 favorite Bonds. In many ways, Tim was both a pioneer and a reformer for the role, leading the series into new and exciting frontiers while getting it back in touch with its tonal roots. It's a strange and wonderful dichotomy embodied within the Welsh actor, and while I'm forever grateful to have had both The Living Daylights and License to Kill, I remain depressed that Timothy Dalton's tenure was so short, and that we were likely only beginning to see one of the most unique runs in the franchise's long history. As hard as it is to admit, George Lazenby and Timothy Dalton are the forgotten Bonds in the public's mind. That's easy to say given their low number of adventures as the character, but when the other 4 actors have made 4 or more films as the character, it's perhaps inevitable that their contribution will be overlooked. Before Daniel Craig's reboot, there were 20 so-called official films made and 2 unofficial ones. I think we can safely remove Casino Royale 67 from this discussion given the type of movie it is. So that leaves us with 7 Sean Connery films, 7 Roger Moores, 4 Pierce Brosnans, 2 Daltons, and 1 Lazenby. Those first 3 actors have had more chances to shape the public perception of the character, so when people talk about 007, there's a good chance they'll be drawing from their experience with those 3 actors. But is it merely lack of exposure to the other 3 films that relegates Lazenby and Dalton to be outside the public's embrace, or is there more to it? If you listen to journalists and professional reviewers before 2006 talk about Bond, you'd sometimes get the remark, Lazenby and Dalton just don't feel like Bond. I think what they mean is that the 3 films coupled with the actors' takes are so different from the others that they land themselves outside the mold. Sean Connery defined this role, Roger Moore refined it, and Pierce Brosnan modernized it. With these folks, Bond is an archetype. A male fantasy character who lives each day like it's his last, but with a tongue-in-cheek attitude. He has an impenetrable shell guarding his emotions that he might as well be a 2-dimensional pulp hero. That's not to say the films aren't extraordinarily fun to watch and are not great examples of British cinema. Rather, you don't go to Bond for life-altering stories, for 3-dimensional characters, or for themes that resonate with you long after the credits roll. And the films that did go that route of the first 20, like For Your Eyes Only and The World Is Not Enough, tend to be less successful and more divisive anyways. George Lazenby and Timothy Dalton both had stories that treated Bond as a flawed human being, that made long-lasting emotional choices, that showed the man's heart, that prioritized story over action. Not that the action wasn't standout, but that it was less of an e-ticket ride of a viewing and something that demanded more from an audience. The action was secondary to the story being told, and thus these films bucked that trend. Mariella Frostrup, for the James Bond 007 story documentary, states,
"For me, Bond is a one-dimensional character, and whenever they've tried to turn him into a 3-dimensional, feeling, caring human being, it just doesn't work. He's a caricature. He's an action hero in the best sense of the word. And I think the problem with George Lazenby and also with Timothy Dalton was that both of them took it very seriously as an acting role, and it's not."
Her statement seems to mirror some things I've heard from other corners of fandom, particularly after Daniel Craig's tenure wrapped up. To these fans, Bond is a fantasy. If you inject too much reality into him, you uncover the absurdity inherent in the concept, which kills the fun we have with a guy who was once called Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. If you start questioning whether Bond should regularly get checked up for STDs, whether he should start asking consent before sex, or if he should consider the family that poor guard he killed is left behind, then you become a party pooper and a killjoy. The thing is, this is not what Ian Fleming had in mind when he wrote the character. The literary Bond is an ugly contradiction of a man. A hero not to be emulated. A man who didn't sleep well at night. A man who regularly fell in love and had his heart broken. He was more of a grounded type of fantasy that Fleming himself longed to be. I think Cubby and Harry understood this and made a conscious choice to downplay those darker traits and go for a more pure hero. He still had a license to kill. He still drank a lot of alcohol, and he could get nasty at times. But these were features of his life. They weren't meant to be looked at with an analytical eye to try to discern the man underneath. These were the things that made this hero different from others, but he was still fundamentally a hero. And it's hard to argue that wasn't the right choice at the time given the Connery and Moore's films' great success with critics and audiences. I understand the sentiment, but I can't say I agree with it. To me, if we take no chances with the character to try something else, if we constantly want this version that lends itself to less thought-provoking tales and more party on good versus evil stories, I'd say he's become a stale figure that doesn't need more than a few films. Comparing Bond to Batman for a bit, the danger in only allowing for those kinds of movies is that the James Bond films become like the Adam West Show. When you've seen one episode, you've seen them all. We've then become rigidly attached to a one-trick pony. We've subscribed to this version with a dogmatism that allows for no real variety. As much as I love Adam West's version, I'd be disheartened if that's all we got. We'd never get the rich subsequent stories of Denny O'Neil, Frank Miller, or Grant Morrison that allow for us to be edified from the experience. Not all of these are going to be winners. In fact, you might end up with more duds than before. But this experimentation leads to discovering new blood for the series and guarantees a future for the character. Lazenby and Dalton may not be for everyone. In fact, I'm not even sure they are for most people. Yet, if you're open to them, you may find some fresh ground and ideas for the property. These actors allowed for Bond to be emotionally rattled, allowed for lasting consequences that could go into future films. This type allows for overarching stories and can lead to different structures for films beyond the normal Bond gets an assignment from M, goes to an exotic location, defeats the villain with evil designs for the planet, and gets the girl in the end formula. This is not a put down to anyone who prefers the more formulaic types of adventures. There's a comfort and a joy that comes from those, and there are some undeniably great adventures to be found there. But I don't think the essence of Bond as a character is so tied to this formula that it doesn't allow for some nuance. For that reason, I love going back to Lazenby's On Her Majesty's Secret Service and the Dalton duology. These men got the role of a lifetime, took it seriously, and tried to make a lasting mark on the character that would survive long after their time. And given how successful Daniel Craig's take has become with the public and how polarizing he is with us fans, I'd say the legacy of Lazenby and Dalton was made sure and will continue to leave its mark alongside the more well-known and popular actors.